So when we're asking what was the role of the state in the Atlantic economy, this is essentially it. They're working hand in glove with the merchant capitalists. They're providing protection in exchange for some of the revenue. And of course, again, looking ahead to the American Revolution here, if you ask Tom Paine, what does the state do? How does government and how does taxation work? He says, under a king, it's basically a shakedown. You have the person, the group of people, the nobility with the biggest weapons come into town and say, it looks like you need some protection here because you're all farmers and you don't have any weapons. Well, we do have the weapons. It would be a shame if something happened to your village. Why don't you give us your money and call us your kings and your nobles? So in a way, this is an old established pattern. You get protection in exchange for money. But in this case, with merchant capital and with the Atlantic empires, it works because both parties think it's a great deal, and it works for both of them. For instance, the Navigation Acts, which really are the main tool of the mercantilism, which is to say that economic policy that gives your own merchants exclusive deals and exclusive access to your empire overseas. And the Navigation Acts lay down how you do that. In the 1640s, under Oliver Cromwell, when briefly the Puritans govern Britain, they're pretty innovative in what they come up with, and the Navigation Acts are one such example that gets copied far and wide by other European states. And that says, and this is relevant for North America, if you have a colony, nobody else can go into that colony and make deals and trade. Only British merchants can do that on British ships with British sailors. And for the most part, this works in favor of the colonists as well. So in North America, the British colonists are pretty happy that the Royal Navy is protecting them from the French, that the army is protecting them from the natives, and of course from the Spanish as well. And if that means they can't trade with the French and Spanish colonies, even though there's a lot of money to be made, they can accept that, especially if the crown, as they do, occasionally look the other way. If you're sending a ship with grain to England that then just happens to arrive after a storm and some regrettable navigational errors in Haiti on a French island that happens to need lots of grain because all they do with their land is grow sugar and employ slaves. And the British will practice what is called benign neglect. So they look the other way because they realize, yes, this is how people make their money, and it doesn't really do any harm to us. Now, these advantages of the protection for the British North American colonists might turn out to be outweighed by the disadvantages. Because once the crown starts cracking down on the trade, on the direct trade with foreign countries and their colonies, then that is no longer in your interest. It means you're going to make less money. Once the crown starts to limit where these North American British settlers can settle, because the British don't want to alienate the Native Americans any further and are saying, well, let's not provoke them by taking away that much of their land. Please stay on this side of the Appalachians. That becomes a disadvantage of this system of empire for the colonists. To be subject to British laws is fine and well, as long as what they do is mostly to protect you and your property. But once they also coerce you to do things that cost you money, once you're being taxed directly by London, especially since you have no say in how these taxes are raised and what they're spent on, when you're taxed without representation, suddenly the picture changes. So to be under the umbrella of the British Empire goes from being a blessing to being a curse. what you see then at the time that the 7 Years' War takes place, about which you're reading, well, actually you already read about it last week, because what Equiano relates, the moment when his master sells him by, in this fly-by-night fashion from one ship to another, they're coming back from fighting the 7 Years' War. Whereas this week you're reading the treaty between the governments that waged that war, in which they concluded. So the 7 Years' War generally can be seen as that point where, not just in British North America, the comfortable arrangement where the merchants pay for most of the cost of empire comes to an end, where the cost of protection begins to exceed the value. And yes, for the North American settlers, this is important because it explains how we get to the American Revolution. But it's not just for the North American settlers. It turns out it's more or less for everybody. Imagine what cost it is to fight a war like the 7 Years' War on a global scale. If you look at the map, if you're doing your worksheet, you'll realize just how far over the face of the globe the fighting stretches in this war. And it isn't one country that's doing all that fighting. You have 4 countries that all have to maintain navies and means of communication and so forth that enables each of them to run an empire that can project its power into every corner of the globe. So if you have to have a navy of that size that can take care of the entire world, but you're only governing one part of that world, and in fact you're fighting because you're competing with other countries over just how much of that world you control and on how much revenue you can therefore fall back that you gain from that control over the land. Nobody is going to have enough money to do that. There simply isn't enough to go around. So you have these humongous armies and navies, and what they're protecting, the system of slavery and exploitation and foreign trade to bring the proceeds and benefits back home to Britain, that simply doesn't pay the cost. So while the British deal with this problem by slapping new taxes on their North American colonists after the war ends, in order to make them pay for most of the cost of the war, the French just lost quite a few of their colonies, so they can't go down that road. They have to ask their own citizens to pay more money, and that on top of the French help that also cost a lot of money that they sent to the Americans when they fought for their own independence between 1779 and 1783. For the most part, that's when the biggest chunk of French assistance came. France goes bankrupt. They simply can't pay for it. And Britain only avoids the bankruptcy because they can tax the North American colonists. And this bankruptcy of France posits that problem for the system of sovereignty and legitimacy hitting a wall for the French. The king has to take the extraordinary step to ask the people to allow him to raise new taxes. Now, of course, he's an absolute monarch, and a lot of what he does doesn't involve asking people anything. But in this particular case, in France and in Britain, absolutism, though it may be, is often misunderstood to mean that kings really can get away with anything, and that is not true. Especially when it comes to old established rights that the nobility and the cities and the guilds might have. Most of these rights involve, of course, to make your own laws and to also decide what you do with your money, the kings can't touch that. In fact, one of the reasons why the British had to ask the North American colonists for their money is because when the king and his government asked the British Parliament for money, the nobility that controls the House of Lords said, "We're glad you brought up the issue of taxation. We've been meaning to make a case that we, as the backbone of the British economy, we, the aristocracy, are paying far too much in taxes." So in response to that fiscal crisis, to the need to come up with more money to pay for that globe-spanning 7 years war, the British nobility said, yes, let's vote for a tax cut. We're going to pay less money because, after all, who is more important to our country than us, the nobility, and what's good for us is good for the country. And the king could do absolutely nothing about it. And it turns out the exact same thing then happens in France, only in a much more radical fashion. The nobility basically say, let's just get rid of all the taxes on us. Yes, we know that the king needs money to fight his foreign wars and the state is bankrupt. How was that our problem again? Because we have these ancient established rights that we get to do what we want with our money. So how about the king ask the people instead? So he has to do that. And he can't just increase or levy taxes on the general population. And of course, the nobility and the church in France, the high clergy, make up for a fraction of the population, less than 5%, although they control most of the wealth in the country. But in order to tax the rest of the population, Louis has to call the French Parliament into session, and that hadn't been called into session in more than 100 years. Because by ancient constitutional provisions, these Estates General do have the right to change who gets taxed and who gets to ask them for taxes. And when the Estates General are elected and they get together in Versailles, which is the seat of royal power in France, the first thing that they do, because of the political ideas that motivate and animate the people who were elected to these estates, but the first thing they do is to say, we want a constitution. We don't want to just be used to increase taxes and then be sent home. We want to have elections on a regular basis. We want the people who are elected to sit in session and make decisions about laws and policy on a regular basis. We want a constitutional government where the king is answerable to the representatives of the people. And so because the king doesn't want that, next thing you know, he has a revolution on his hands, the French Revolution. So, and then of course the French Revolution, like the American, asks the question of renegotiating the balance between power and law, between sovereignty and legitimacy. Yes, the state has the power to take people's money and use it for common purposes. It gets to tax. But do the people get to have a voice in how much and for what purpose and purposes this money gets spent? And because the system in place, the British Empire, the French monarchy, don't allow for settling that question, that conflict, in a satisfactory manner to most people, the result you get is revolutions that ask for the ground rules of government to be rewritten, so that the need for government to ask the people about lawmaking and raising taxes, declaring war, maintaining armies, and all that are changed and are codified, are written down in constitutions. So this is that part.